3 days after my wedding, my new stepson arrived at my front door with a lawyer and papers that would put my house under my husband's control. It was 9:12 on a Tuesday morning. I remember the time because I'd just looked at the microwave clock and wondered whether 9 in the morning was too early to eat the last piece of wedding cake. At 57, I've decided there are fewer rules about cake than people pretend. Richard had left around 7:30 for a client meeting in Columbus. I was still in my robe drinking coffee and sorting through wedding cards at the kitchen counter when the camera doorbell chimed. I glanced at my phone. Evan, my new husband's 34-year-old son, was standing on my porch in a navy quarterzip, looking considerably more dressed for business than I was. Beside him stood a man I'd never seen before. Gray suit, leather briefcase. I opened the door halfway. Morning. Hey Maggie, Evan smiled, sorry to drop by. The man beside him extended his hand. Graham Pike. I shook it. Then he added, I'm an attorney now, there are sentences that improve a Tuesday morning. I brought donuts. Your property taxes have been abolished. George Clooney is lost and needs directions. I'm an attorney is rarely one of them. I looked at Evan. Should I put on shoes? He laughed like I was joking. I wasn't entirely. It's nothing bad, he said. Dad wanted us to get some paperwork handled. Dad has my phone number. He's tied up with a client. Graham looked slightly uncomfortable already, which I found interesting. I let them in. We sat at the dining room table, where 3 nights earlier, Richard and I had opened champagne after coming home from our wedding reception. There were still 2 unopened cards on the sideboard. Graham placed a folder in front of me. I understand Richard discussed some estate planning changes with you. No. He stopped. Evan jumped in. Not specifically, maybe. That's generally what discussed means. Maggie, it's routine, that word routine. I opened the folder. The first page had a name printed across the top. Bennett Family Holdings, LLC. I read enough legal documents during 32 years of marriage to Thomas to know one thing: if somebody is waiting for your signature, don't start with the signature page. I turned back to page 1. Graham explained that the proposal involved transferring title to my house into the LLC. He used phrases like asset protection, estate efficiency, and simplifying things for the family. I let him finish. Then I asked who owns Bennett Family Holdings, even answered too quickly. It's Dad's company, Graham corrected him. Richard is the managing member. Evan also holds an interest. I looked from one to the other. What interest do I hold? Neither answered immediately. That answered it. So, let me make sure I've got this right. The family company has my husband in it. Yes, Graham said. And his son? Yes, and not me. Graham adjusted the papers. The ownership structure can certainly be revisited. I looked at Evan. And we're putting my house in it. He sighed. It's just paperwork, Maggie. I've noticed people usually say that when it's paperwork, they want somebody else to sign. Graham almost smiled. Evan didn't. For context, the house wasn't some mansion behind iron gates. It was a comfortable brick home in Dublin, Ohio. 4 bedrooms, a small backyard kitchen remodeled 8 years earlier because Thomas had once opened a cabinet and the door came off in his hand. We'd bought it together, raised our daughter there. Thomas died there. The mortgage had been paid off years ago. I wasn't sentimental about every chair or lampshade in the place, but the deed was mine. And 3 days into my new marriage, 2 men were sitting at my table explaining why that should change. I picked up my phone. I'm calling Richard. Evan leaned back. Dad's in a meeting. Then he'll call me afterward. I called. Voicemail. I waited 30 seconds and called again. Voicemail. Evan checked his watch. I noticed because he did it again, maybe 2 minutes later. Use some somewhere you need to be. No, because your wrist seems worried. He gave me an irritated look. Maggie, Dad said you'd probably get emotional about the house. That one got me. I didn't say anything for a moment. Not because Evan had insulted me. I'd been called worse things by better people. It was because Richard had apparently anticipated this conversation. He'd talked about my reaction with his son, maybe even planned around it. I looked at Graham. If I sign this, what authority does Richard have over property owned by this LLC? Graham chose his words carefully. As manager, he would have fairly broad authority under the operating agreement, including borrowing. He paused. Potentially, yes. Evan cut in. That's not what this is about. I asked the lawyer. Graham nodded once. The agreement does contemplate financing transactions. I closed the folder. I'm not signing anything. Evan stared at me. Seriously, very. You haven't even read all of it. Then I'm definitely not signing it. Graham spoke before Evan could. Mrs. Bennett is absolutely entitled to have independent counsel review these documents. Mrs. Bennett? That was still new enough that I almost looked around for somebody else. Evan pushed his chair back. Dad's trying to protect the family. I met his eyes. I thought I was the family. He didn't have much to say after that. Graham gathered his briefcase. I kept the copies. At the door, Evan said, "You're making this into something it isn't." Then Richard shouldn't have any trouble explaining what it is. They left at 9:47. I locked the door and stood there for a few seconds. Then I called Laura Chen. Laura had handled estate matters for Thomas and me for years. She'd also coordinated with the attorney who represented me when Richard and I negotiated our prenup. She answered on the fourth ring. "Maggie, aren't you supposed to be newly married and ignoring everybody?" That was the plan. "What happened?" "My stepson just brought me a lawyer." There was a pause. "That seems early." Despite myself, I laughed. "I have some documents I need you to look at. Send them." I made coffee and sat back down. I wasn't trying to play detective. I didn't suddenly believe Richard was some criminal mastermind. I wanted there to be a boring explanation. In fact, I was counting on one. While scanning the operating agreement again, I found the section Graham had mentioned. The manager could negotiate financing involving company property. That didn't mean Richard planned to borrow against my house, but it meant I would have been a fool not to ask. Then I went back to the LLC paperwork, registered agent, business address, manager, formation date. I read the date once, then again, 11 days before our wedding. I sat back. That bothered me more than anything Evan had said. 11 days before our wedding, I had been arguing with the florist about whether we really needed extra greenery on tables. Nobody would remember. Richard had been creating Bennett Family Holdings. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. I wanted one badly enough that I'm embarrassed to admit how quickly I started inventing possibilities for him. Maybe his accountant recommended it. Maybe it involved some unrelated property. Maybe Evan was the one pushing everything. Then I looked at the wedding cards on the counter. One was still standing open to Maggie and Richard. "May this be the beginning of your happiest chapter." I reached over and turned it face down, because by then I wasn't really wondering why my husband wanted my house in an LLC. I was wondering why he decided he needed that LLC before I ever became his wife. I didn't tell Richard I'd called Laura. That may sound calculating. It wasn't. At least it didn't feel that way at the time. I simply wanted one conversation where I wasn't reacting to information somebody else had already had time to prepare. After Evan left, I spent most of the afternoon doing ordinary things badly. I ran the dishwasher half full, started laundry and forgot about it, went to the grocery store for milk, and came home with coffee filters, bananas, and no milk. My mind kept circling back to the same question. Why before the wedding? And once that question got into my head, older conversations started coming back, not dramatic ones. That's the trouble with hindsight. Nobody plays ominous music when somebody asks whether your mortgage is paid off. About 6 months earlier, Richard and I had been sitting on the back patio when he'd asked, "You and Tom bought this place when 98. Still have a mortgage?" I laughed. "At our age, God, I hope not." He'd smiled. Smart, that was it. Another time driving home from dinner, he'd asked whether Thomas had kept any commercial property after selling the company. "A couple of buildings," I'd said. "Still in the family, some are." Then he'd changed the subject to Ohio State football. Nothing about those conversations had bothered me. Richard knew I had money. That was never a secret between us. When we'd negotiated the prenup, both of us had separate attorneys. My financial schedules made it very clear that I had substantial assets from my marriage to Thomas. Richard had his retirement accounts, business interests, and property. I had mine. We weren't two 25-year-olds starting out with a sofa and $2,200. We were people in our 60s, or close enough in my case, with entire lives behind us. The exact current value of my investments wasn't something I discussed over meatloaf. Apparently, though, Richard had been paying attention to the shape of things. One memory bothered me more than the others. I'd been complaining about the estimate for replacing part of the roof. Richard had laughed and said, "You're lucky you don't have to worry about money like normal people." I'd laughed too. Sitting alone at my kitchen table now, I heard the sentence differently. Not like I do, like normal people. At 6:40 that evening, the garage door opened. Richard came in carrying a white paper bag from the little Italian restaurant I liked. "Peace offering," he called. That was an unfortunate choice of words. "For what?" He appeared in the kitchen doorway and kissed my cheek. Being gone all day 3 days after our wedding, he held up the bag. "Lasagna, garlic bread, that salad you like with too much cheese." I watched him unpack everything. He looked normal. Same blue shirt he'd left in that morning. Reading glasses sticking out of his breast pocket. Slight crease between his eyebrows from a day of staring at contracts. I almost wished he'd looked guilty. Instead, he looked like my husband. "How was your day?" I asked. "Long. Anything unusual happened?" "Not really." He took 2 plates from the cabinet. I waited. He didn't say another word. Finally, I said, "Your son brought a lawyer to my house." Richard stopped with the lasagna container halfway open. There it was, only for a second, Maggie. His name was Graham. I know Graham. I assumed so. He wasn't selling magazine subscriptions. Richard set the container down. "Evan wasn't supposed to come over without me talking to you first. That's interesting because Evan seemed to think you sent him. I told him we needed to get some things organized." He jumped ahead. "With your lawyer. He's worked with Graham before." I pulled out a chair. "Sit down." Richard stared at me. "Can we eat first?" "No," he sat. I put the LLC documents between us. "What is Bennett Family Holdings?" He rubbed his forehead. "It's exactly what Graham probably told you. An entity for consolidating some family assets, estate planning, liability protection. Why isn't my name on it?" "It could be, but it isn't, Maggie. You're getting hung up on a draft." "Why was the draft at my house with a place for my signature?" He leaned back. "Because eventually I thought we'd put the house into it." "You thought?" "Yes." "Did you think about asking me I was going to before or after I signed?" His mouth tightened. "That isn't fair." Neither of us spoke for a few seconds. Then Richard said, "Look, Evan handled this badly. I'll talk to him. This isn't about Evan. He's the one who showed up. You created the LLC. That stopped him." I slid the formation page across the table and tapped the date. 11 days before our wedding. Richard looked down for the first time. His irritation replaced the apologetic tone. So I wasn't your wife 11 days before our wedding. We knew we were getting married. Apparently you also knew where you wanted my house." He stood. "Come on, Maggie." "No, explain it. We're married now. At some point, there has to be an ours." "I agree." That seemed to surprise him. I said, "There absolutely should be an ours." His shoulders loosened. "But ours doesn't begin with your name on my deed." He looked away. I hated that we were having the conversation. That's probably the part people don't understand when they hear stories like this afterward. They imagine you feel powerful the moment you catch something wrong. I didn't. I felt tired. I wanted him to say one thing that would let me go back 3 hours and stop wondering. Eventually Richard sat down again. "You're right. I waited. I should have talked to you first, yes. And I shouldn't have let Evan get involved." "No. I'll take care of it." "What does that mean?" "We won't move the house, just like that." He reached across the table, but I didn't take his hand. His face changed. "Maggie, I'm sorry." And the awful thing was he sounded sorry. We ate dinner 20 minutes later. The lasagna was cold. Neither of us mentioned it. That night, Richard said he'd sleep in the guest room and give me some space. I told him he didn't have to. He said, "I think I do." After he left the bedroom, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. There was a framed wedding photograph on the dresser. Richard was looking at me in it instead of the camera. I remembered the first year after Thomas died. People had worried about birthdays and anniversaries, but nobody warned me about Tuesdays. Tuesdays were worse. Nothing happened on Tuesdays. No one checked on you. You'd walk into the house with groceries and realize nobody cared whether you'd remembered the milk. Once, about 6 months after Thomas died, I'd come home from dinner with Denise and called into the hallway. "Tom?" You wouldn't believe what Denise. Then I'd stopped. The house had answered for him. Richard had changed that. He'd made ordinary days ordinary again. Coffee in the morning. Somebody complaining about the thermostat. somebody asking if we needed anything from the store. I wasn't ready to believe all of that had been a setup. The next morning, Laura called. "I've read the documents." I went into Thomas's old office and closed the door. "Tell me I'm overreacting. I can't do that." That wasn't what I wanted to hear. She explained that nothing could happen to my house without my signature. I wasn't in immediate danger, but if you transferred it, it would become an LLC asset. Richard, as manager, would have broad authority under this agreement. To do what, among other things, negotiate financing involving company assets. I stared out the window so he could borrow against it. There are details and limitations we'd need to examine, but that's the concern I would have before you transferred anything. I sat down. Laura asked, "Has Richard mentioned needing collateral? No, a business loan? No. Any project? Having trouble? No." She was quiet. Then she said, "I did find something you should see." Richard and Evan were both connected to a redevelopment project outside Dayton. That part wasn't news. Richard had talked about Dayton for nearly a year. What I didn't know was that the project had recently been seeking additional financing. Laura was careful not to make conclusions she couldn't support. She didn't have to. I thought about Evan sitting at my dining table, checking his watch twice. Suddenly, the hurry made sense. Maybe Bennett Family Holdings wasn't about what happened to my house after I died. Maybe it was about what Richard needed my house to do while I was very much alive. Laura didn't uncover some secret file that explained everything. I wish life worked that way. One folder, preferably labeled things your husband forgot to tell you, and you could be home by lunch. Instead, we spent the next 2 days putting together pieces that didn't look especially dramatic on their own. Richard and Evan's project outside Dayton had started with a plan that sounded reasonable enough. They'd bought an aging office complex with 2 other investors and intended to convert part of it into apartments, with restaurants and retail on the ground floor. Richard had shown me the architectural renderings months earlier. Trees where there weren't any trees, young couples drinking coffee on balconies. A golden retriever in one picture, which apparently is required by law whenever developers want you to believe someplace will be pleasant. I'd told him it looked nice. What he hadn't told me was how badly the numbers had changed. Construction costs had climbed. A restaurant group pulled out. One investor refused to put in more money. The lender wanted additional financial support before extending the next round of financing. Laura estimated the immediate problem at roughly $2.8 million. I didn't need a course in commercial real estate to understand it. They'd bought something expensive with borrowed money. It wasn't earning what they'd promised. And now, everybody wanted somebody else to take the risk, including apparently me. Richard became remarkably attentive during those 2 days. Thursday morning, he made coffee before I got downstairs. There were flowers on the kitchen counter that afternoon. Friday, he brought home breakfast from a diner we liked. I finally looked at the flowers and said, "You know, chrysanthemums don't fix legal documents. They're not supposed to." "Then what are they doing?" He gave me a tired smile. "Being flowers. That almost got me." Richard had always been good at that. Bringing a conversation down from the ledge without making you feel foolish for being upset. "I talked to Evan," he said, "and he won't bother you again." "That's not exactly the problem. I know." He sat across from me. "I'll dissolve the LLC if that's what you want." I studied him just like that. "Yes." "Why?" "Because it was a bad idea." That was exactly what I wanted him to say, which made me suspicious of how relieved I felt hearing it. He reached for my hand. This time, I let him take it. "I handled this badly, Maggie." "Yes, you did. I know." For a few seconds, I could see a way back. Not all the way, but maybe far enough to start. Then Laura called Friday afternoon. "Do you know a Carl Whitfield?" The name was familiar. One of Richard's investors, former investor. Apparently, Carl Whitfield was 66, owned a chain of industrial supply businesses, and had the particular kind of confidence that comes from spending 40 years signing the front of checks instead of the back. I'd met him twice. He wasn't my friend that mattered. Carl hadn't contacted Laura because he wanted to rescue me. He and Richard were disputing what had been represented to investors about additional funding for Dayton. Carl was protecting Carl. I trusted that motive more than sudden heroism. What does he want? I asked to verify whether Richard had authority to represent additional family resources as potentially available. My stomach tightened. What family resources? He didn't specify, but there's something else. Months earlier, Evan had forwarded project correspondence to several people while rushing between meetings. Part of an internal exchange with Richard remained below the forwarded message. Carl had received it. At the time, he apparently hadn't cared about a conversation concerning Richard's future wife. Now he did. With Carl's permission, Laura sent me the relevant portion. I opened it on my laptop. The first message was from Evan, dated 6 weeks before my wedding. I read it, then read it again. Once you're married, she'll loosen up, start with the house. Don't mention anything else until she's used to sharing. I stopped there. Laura was still on the phone. Maggie, I'm here. Below Evan's message was Richard's reply. 4 words did most of the damage. She trusts me. Don't push too hard. I don't remember what Laura said next. I was looking at those words. She trusts me. Richard hadn't told Evan to stay out of our finances. He hadn't said I wasn't some account they could draw from. He hadn't even said, don't talk about my wife that way. He'd told him not to push too hard, as if the problem wasn't what they wanted, only how quickly they asked for it. I need to call you back, I said. Of course. I closed the laptop, then opened it again. There was more. Evan had written, even if Callahan only left her $5 or $6 million, that's enough to stabilize this. I stared at the screen, and then, God help me. I laughed. It wasn't a happy laugh. It just escaped. I called Denise. She answered. You okay? No good start. I read her the email. There was a pause. Then Denise said, wait, he thinks you have $5 million, maybe 6. Another pause. So they tried to rob Fort Knox because they thought it was a nice credit union. Denise, what I'm trying to be supportive. I laughed again. Then I didn't. Thomas and I hadn't started rich. When our daughter was little, I did payroll at the kitchen table after she went to bed. I handled benefits when the company had 11 employees. I once spent an entire Sunday calling customers because our billing software had corrupted a month's worth of invoices. Thomas built the company. So did a lot of people. And in my own less glamorous way, so did I. Years later, after we sold our controlling interest, the proceeds were invested. We still had commercial property. There was insurance after Thomas died. The investments kept growing. By the time I married Richard, the separate assets I controlled were worth a little over $43 million. Richard knew I was wealthy. Our prenup made sure neither of us entered marriage pretending otherwise. But my current net worth wasn't something I gave him quarterly updates on. And Evan clearly knew almost nothing. Apparently, he'd taken a few comments from his father, added confidence, and arrived at $5 or $6 million. That should have made the situation less frightening. Instead, it made it worse. They hadn't needed to know I had $43 million to start planning around my property. 5 was enough. That evening, I sat on the back porch until the mosquitoes decided I'd had enough reflection. There was one question I kept avoiding. If Richard had come to me 6 weeks before the wedding and said Maggie Dayton is in trouble, I may lose a lot of money. Would you consider helping me? What would I have said? I knew the answer. Probably yes, not blindly. Not $2.8 million dropped into his lap with a kiss and a casserole. I would have asked questions. Laura would have reviewed everything. There would have been protections, but I probably would have helped my husband. That was what hurt. Not that Richard wants something from me, that he decided asking honestly was less useful than managing me. My phone rang a little after 7. Richard. I let it ring twice before answering. Hi. His voice sounded different. No charm, no careful reassurance. Maggie, we need to talk about what Dayton. I waited. There's something I haven't told you. I looked through the kitchen window. His flowers were still on the counter. All right. I'll be home in about 40 minutes. We hung up. Less than 10 minutes later, Laura called. I received another document from Whitfield. I almost didn't want to know. What is it? A financing presentation Richard's team circulated, and there is a section describing potential sources of financial support. I stood very still. Laura read the phrase to me. Significant family liquidity available if required. I looked at the wedding ring on my hand. Then I asked the only question that mattered, whose family. Laura didn't answer. She didn't need to. Richard got home 32 minutes later. I know because I watched the clock. Not because I was waiting to catch him in something. I was still hoping he'd walk through that door and tell me enough truth to make the last few days look different. He found me at the kitchen table. The flowers he'd brought me were between us. Richard took off his jacket and sat down. I should have told you Dayton was in trouble. Yes. He rubbed both hands over his face. It wasn't supposed to get this bad. Things rarely are. He told me the rest. The project was running out of room. The lender wanted more support. Contractors were waiting on payments. Richard had personally guaranteed part of the debt. If the deal collapsed badly enough, he could lose a significant portion of what he'd spent 30 years building. Evan had money in it, too. How much do you need? I asked. Richard hesitated. Immediately somewhere around 3,2.8. His eyes lifted. That was the moment he realized I'd been asking questions of my own. Laura found that some of it. He leaned back. So you've got lawyers digging through my business now? No, I have a lawyer reviewing documents your son brought into my house. That's not the same thing. No, Richard, it isn't. He stood and walked toward the sink. I wasn't trying to take your house. I looked at him. Then why did a lawyer bring me papers transferring it? I wanted options. For whom? For us. There it is again. What us? I pointed toward the hallway. That word didn't appear anywhere in Bennett Family Holdings. He turned away. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then Richard sat down again. His voice changed. Quieter. You know how many people are tied to this project. I know it's more than you and Evan. Contractors, employees, small investors, people who trusted me. That word didn't escape me. Trusted. Richard continued. If Dayton falls apart, this isn't just me losing money. I understand that. Do you? Yes. Because right now it feels like you're treating me like some guy who showed up at your door asking for a check. No. Your son did that. He flinched. I regretted the line almost as soon as I said it. Not because it wasn't true, because I didn't want every conversation between us to become a contest for the sharpest sentence. Richard stared down at the table. Then he said, if Thomas were alive and his company was in trouble, would you help him? That shut me up. He looked at me. Would you? Yes. There was no point lying. Thomas and I had risked everything together more than once. Early in the business, we'd borrowed against our first house to buy equipment. Of course, I would have helped him. Richard nodded. Then why am I different? I hated how reasonable the question sounded. You're not Thomas. I know that. And Thomas would have asked me. Richard's expression changed. I went on. He wouldn't have created a company without me put himself in charge of it, then sent somebody over with papers for my house. I said I was sorry. I know. I'll dissolve the LLC. You already said that, and I'll keep Evan out of our finances. I looked at him. I mean it, Maggie. Part of me wanted to believe him so badly. I could almost feel myself leaning toward it. That's embarrassing now. It wasn't then. I had married this man because I loved him. 3 days didn't erase 18 months, and grief had taught me something people don't talk about much. Once you've lost marriage to death, you're not eager to throw another one away, even when common sense is clearing its throat in the corner. 2 days later, Richard and I sat in a counselor's office in Worthington. Her name was Dr. Susan Keller. She was probably around my age, wore sensible shoes, and had the unnerving habit of letting silence sit there until somebody finally told the truth just to get rid of it. Richard explained Dayton. He explained the financing deadline. He explained Evan. He explained that he'd intended to discuss everything with me. Susan listened. Then she asked, why didn't you ask Maggie before making plans involving her property? Richard started talking about the lender. Susan waited. He moved on to the project deadline. She waited some more. Then Evan. Finally, she said, those things explain why you needed money. Richard stopped. They don't explain why you didn't ask your wife. There was a long silence. I looked at Richard. He stared at the carpet. Finally, he said, I thought she'd say no. That was probably the most honest thing he'd told me all week. I said, you never gave me the chance. I know, and I believed he understood. At least I wanted to. The next couple of days weren't easy. People had begun hearing that the Dayton project was in trouble. One woman we knew from a neighborhood dinner stopped me outside the grocery store. Richard must be under terrible pressure. He is. She touched my arm. Marriage is a partnership, Maggie. I knew what she meant. She didn't know enough to mean anything cruel by it. Still, I sat in my SUV afterward for 10 minutes. $43 million. That number had started feeling less like security, and more like an accusation. I could solve Richard's immediate problem, not casually. $3 million is $3 million no matter what you're worth. But I could do it without losing my home or wondering how I'd pay for groceries. Maybe refusing to help, simply because he'd asked badly, was its own kind of pride. That night, I almost called Laura. I had even worked out what I'd say. A secured loan, independent appraisal, no control over my other assets, no Evan, everything documented. I never made the call. The following afternoon, Laura called me first. Carl Whitfield contacted me again. I closed my eyes. What now? Richard met with another potential financing group yesterday. I sat up. Yesterday? Yes, yesterday was the day we'd left counseling. What did he tell them? The revised material is more careful. That didn't reassure me. Laura read the wording. Additional family resources under discussion. I stared at the wall. Under discussion. Technically, I suppose that was clever. Richard and I certainly had discussed my money, mostly in sentences beginning with, "Why did you?" But nothing was available. Nothing had been offered. And after counseling, he knew exactly where I stood. That evening I waited until we'd finished dinner. "Did you meet another lender yesterday?" Richard didn't even look surprised. "No, I watched him. Maybe Laura had the date wrong. Maybe Carl did." I gave Richard an exit. "Think before you answer me again." Now he looked at me. "Maggie, did you meet with another financing group yesterday?" "No. The strange thing is I didn't get angry. Something simply settled. The LLC had frightened me. The email had hurt me. But this was different." Richard knew I knew enough to ask the question. He'd sat beside me in counseling less than 24 hours earlier, and admitted he should have asked rather than planned around me, and now he was lying directly to my face twice. I nodded. "All right," he frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm tired." I went upstairs. The next morning after Richard left, I called Laura. "I need a family law attorney." She was quiet for a second. "Are you sure?" "No." That answer surprised both of us. Then I said, "But I'm sure I can't stay married while I wait to become sure." Laura gave me a referral. With counsel, I began the process of ending the marriage under the prenup. I also authorized formal notices, making one thing absolutely clear. None of my separate assets, my house investment accounts, property interests, anything were available as collateral guarantees or financial support for the Dayton project. I didn't call Richard's investors. I didn't threaten his business. I didn't demand anybody punish him. I simply removed my name and my money from a story I had never agreed to be part of. A few days later, Carl forwarded another investor presentation to Laura. Richard and Evan were making one last major pitch at a private luncheon in downtown Columbus. Most of the wording about family resources had disappeared. Most one line remained. Family financial capacity provides additional downside protection. I read it 3 times. Apparently, even after everything, my silence was still being treated like something Richard could spend. So, I called Laura. "I want that corrected. It will be." "No." I looked at the page again. I want them to hear it from me." For the first time since Evan walked through my front door with that folder, I wasn't wondering what Richard was going to do next. I knew what I was going to do. Laura did not love my idea. "I understand why you want to be there," she said. "That doesn't mean you walk into a private investor meeting uninvited." I wasn't planning to kick down the door. "I know. I don't even own boots suitable for that." She ignored me, which was one of the reasons I paid her. Instead, she contacted counsel for the financing group and told them I disputed any suggestion that my separate assets were available to support the Dayton project. That got their attention. By Monday afternoon, they wanted clarification directly from me, so I was invited to attend part of the meeting. Not quite the dramatic entrance I might have imagined at 30. At 57, I've learned that being expected is often more useful than being dramatic. The meeting was a Wednesday at 11:30 in a conference room at a large hotel in downtown Columbus. Laura met me in the lobby. "You okay?" she asked. "No good." I looked at her. She smiled slightly. People who say they're fine before meetings like this usually aren't paying attention. There were maybe 20 people in the room. Investors, lawyers, 2 lender renter representatives, Richard's business partner, Carl Whitfield, and Evan. Richard was standing near a screen displaying a rendering of the Dayton project. When I walked in, he saw me immediately. His expression changed. "Maggie, Richard, what are you doing here?" I looked past him at the screen. The words capital structure were printed across the top. "Apparently, I'm part of the capital structure." Evan turned toward his father. Richard lowered his voice. "Can we talk outside?" Laura answered before I did, after the clarification. That was another reason I paid her. We sat at the far end of the table. Nobody yelled. Nobody threatened anybody. In real life, the rooms where people can lose millions of dollars are often disappointingly quiet. One of the lender representatives, a man named Mark Ellison, opened a folder. "Mrs. Bennett, thank you for coming. We need clarity on one issue." Of course, he looked toward Richard. "Mr. Bennett, our understanding from prior materials was that additional families' financial resources might be available if necessary." Richard leaned forward. "I think that language has been interpreted more broadly than intended." Mark didn't react. "Are your wife's separate assets available to support this transaction?" Richard glanced at me. "We've been discussing several possibilities." "No." The word came out before I had time to dress it up. Everybody looked at me. I kept my voice level. "My separate assets are not available to support this project." Richard shifted in his chair. "Maggie, that's not entirely, it is entirely accurate." Laura touched the edge of her folder but didn't interrupt. I continued. "I have never agreed to pledge my home. I have never agreed to guarantee project debt. I have never authorized my investment accounts or property interests to be presented as financial support for Dayton." Mark looked at Richard. Richard said, "No one is claiming there's a binding commitment." "That isn't what I asked," Mark said. Carl leaned back in his chair. I could almost hear Denise in my head saying, "Well, this is going nicely." Richard tried again. "The phrase family resources was intended to communicate overall financial stability. Maggie and I are married. Obviously, we've discussed," Evan interrupted. "This is ridiculous." Richard turned. "Evan, no, Dad, it is." Evan looked directly at me. "We're talking about an entire development here. Contractors, investors, people's jobs, and she's sitting on money her first husband left her, because she's mad about some paperwork." "Stop," Richard said. Evan didn't. That was Evan's problem. He was a man who thought the next sentence would rescue the previous one. It rarely did. "What are we even arguing about?" He said 5,000,006. The room went very still. I looked at Richard. He looked embarrassed, not surprised. That's when I understood that Richard had never told his son what I was actually worth. Maybe he didn't know the exact number himself. Our prenup had disclosed substantial separate property, but my finances hadn't stopped moving the day we signed it. Investments grew, properties changed value, accounts were consolidated. I didn't send Richard quarterly net worth reports, and apparently Evan had built an entire strategy around a gas. My hand was wrapped around the water glass in front of me. I realized I was gripping it hard enough that my fingers hurt, so I set it down. "My separate assets are currently worth a little over $43 million. Nobody moved. Evan blinked. "43 million? Yes." He stared at me. "You have $43 million. It didn't change in the last 6 seconds, Evan." Someone at the other end of the table coughed into his hand. Carl looked down, but I could see him smiling. I hadn't meant to be funny. "Well, maybe a little." Richard wasn't smiling. He looked at me in a way I hadn't seen before. "You never told me. This meeting isn't about what I told you. 43 million. Maggie, Mark, cut in Mr. Bennett. "The amount isn't actually our concern exactly." That was the strange part. The number sounded enormous in the room, but it wasn't the problem. The problem was whether Richard had been presenting access to money he didn't control. Laura took over. She explained that I was there only to clarify my position and correct any implication that my separate property represented additional support for the project. Then the email came up. Carl had already provided the relevant correspondence in connection with his dispute over the financing representations. Mark read from his copy. I didn't need to look. I knew the words. "Start with the house." Then Richard's reply. "She trusts me. Don't push too hard." Richard leaned forward. "That conversation is being taken completely out of context." Carl finally spoke. "What context improves it?" Richard looked at him. "Evan was talking about integrating family finances after the marriage." Evan said, "Exactly." I turned to him by starting with my house. He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For once, the next sentence failed to arrive. Richard tried to explain that the LLC had never received my property. That was true. He pointed out that no lender had ever been given a guarantee from me. Also true. Laura didn't argue those facts. Neither did I. The investors weren't deciding whether Richard had committed some crime. They were deciding whether they trusted the way he'd represented financial support. One of them, a gray-haired woman who hadn't spoken all morning, closed her folder. I'd like our participation suspended pending further diligence. Another investor nodded. Mark said the financing group would need revised materials and additional review before proceeding. Nobody pounded a table. Nobody announced that Richard Bennett was ruined. The mood simply changed. People stopped looking at him like a man who had brought them a solution. They started looking at him like a man whose numbers needed checking. If you've ever worked in business, you know how expensive that change can be. I stood. Laura stood with me. Richard followed us into the hallway. Maggie. I kept walking until we were away from the conference room door. Then I turned. He looked tired, older somehow. Why didn't you tell you what that it was 43? You knew I had money, not that kind of money. I stared at him. Would it have made you behave better? He didn't answer. That wasn't rhetorical, Richard. I don't know. At least that was honest. He looked toward the conference room, then back at me. If I'd come to you before all this, if I'd just told you Dayton was in trouble and asked you for help, would you have? That was the question I'd already asked myself. I could have lied. It would have been satisfying for about 5 seconds. Instead, I said, probably. His face changed. I would have wanted protections. I would have had Laura look at everything. I wouldn't have handed Evan a blank check. Of course, but yes, I probably would have helped you. Richard looked down. I said quietly, that's the part I can't fix for you. I turned toward the elevators. Evan came out of the conference room behind us. He wasn't angry anymore. That almost made him look younger. So what happens to us now? Richard closed his eyes. I looked at Evan. I don't know. You could still help. There it was. Even now, not I'm sorry. Not. We were wrong. You could still help. I pressed the elevator button. Evan, that's what happens when your backup plan turns out to be a person. The doors opened. Laura and I stepped inside. I held myself together until they closed. Then I reached for the railing along the wall. My hands were shaking. Laura didn't say anything. She didn't tell me I'd been brave. She didn't tell me I'd won. She just stood beside me while we went down 18 floors. I was grateful for that, because I didn't feel victorious. I felt like I'd just watched a marriage end in a conference room full of strangers. And even when ending it is the right thing to do, there's nothing particularly victorious about that. The Dayton project didn't collapse that afternoon. Richard didn't lose everything before dinner. Evan wasn't marched out of the building, carrying a cardboard box. Real consequences usually take longer than that. Over the next few months, the project was restructured. Richard and his partners brought in additional oversight, sold off part of their interest, and accepted terms they would have laughed at a year earlier. Richard took a painful loss. Not ruinous, painful. Evan ended up leaving the project entirely. The last I heard, he'd taken a salaried position with another development company in Cincinnati. Denise called when she heard, so Evan has a boss now, apparently. Somebody who isn't his father. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. That poor boss. I laughed. I shouldn't have, but I did. My divorce from Richard was considerably less entertaining. The prenup did what a good prenup is supposed to do. It didn't punish anybody. It didn't reward anybody. It simply made clear what belonged to whom. My separate property remained mine. Richard kept his. There was no $20 million settlement, no courtroom full of people gasping. No judge leaned over the bench and gave Richard a speech about respecting women. Mostly there were emails, documents, phone calls, signatures. One afternoon, I spent 45 minutes discussing how to divide 2 sets of patio furniture. That's divorce for you, $43 million in assets, and somehow you still end up debating who bought the outdoor cushions. Richard moved out before everything was final. The first night after he'd taken the last of his clothes, I walked through the house, turning off lights. When I reached the guest room, I stopped. His reading glasses were sitting on the nightstand. The cheap pair he used at night. I picked them up. For one stupid second, I nearly called him. Not because I wanted him back. I just knew he'd need them. That's the problem with loving somebody. Your habits don't receive legal notice when the marriage ends. I put the glasses in a padded envelope the next morning and mailed them to his office. No note. About 3 months later, an envelope arrived for me. Richard's handwriting. I left it on the counter until after dinner. Then I opened it. The letter was 4 pages long. He didn't ask me to come back. That surprised me. He didn't blame Evan either. That surprised me more. Richard wrote that he'd spent weeks trying to figure out when he'd crossed the line. He said he had loved me when he proposed. I believed that he'd known I was financially secure. Obviously, our prenup had made that impossible to miss. But when Dayton began going bad, he'd started thinking about what my money could solve. At first, Maggie could help me. Then Maggie should help me. Eventually, of course, Maggie will help me. By the time Evan suggested starting with the house, Richard had already convinced himself that the problem wasn't whether I wanted to help. It was how to get me comfortable enough to do it. There was one sentence in the letter I read several times. I turned your security into my contingency plan. That was probably the closest he ever came to understanding it. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. I didn't answer, not because I hated him. By then, I didn't. That's another thing nobody tells you. Sometimes it's easier when the person who hurt you was secretly terrible all along. Richard wasn't. He could be generous, funny, patient. He'd beside me through the anniversary of Thomas's death, without once acting threatened by a dead man. He knew exactly how I liked my coffee, and always remembered that I hated cilantro, and he still betrayed me. People can love you and behave selfishly. Both things can be true. Accepting that was harder than deciding who got the patio furniture. For a while, I became cautious about money in ways I didn't like. Every time somebody mentioned a charity investment loan, or even an expensive dinner, I noticed myself tightening up. Then one afternoon, Denise and I were reviewing some paperwork from a scholarship fund Thomas and I had started years earlier. It was small. Originally, we'd created it for employees' children. I was reading an application from a 52-year-old woman who'd spent nearly 20 years caring for her children and then her mother. Now, she wanted to train as a respiratory therapist. I read her application twice. Then I called the administrator. Over the following months, I expanded the program. Nothing grandiose. I didn't give away half my estate to prove a point. We simply widened eligibility to women over 45 returning to community college certification programs or vocational training after years spent raising children, caring for family, or rebuilding after losing a spouse. I also set aside money for emergency grants benefiting families connected to Thomas's old company. When I told Denise, she stared at me across lunch. So, let me understand this. That usually worries me. You just spent months keeping people away from your money. Yes, and now you're giving some of it away also. Yes, she pointed her fork at me. Explain. There's a difference between opening your hand and somebody reaching into your pocket. Denise stopped chewing. Then she nodded. That's good, thank you. You should put that on a coffee mug. Then you'd make me pay $18 for it. 22. It's a fundraiser. That was the first time, in months I'd laughed about money, without feeling something sour underneath it. On what would have been our 34th wedding anniversary, I drove out to the cemetery where Thomas was buried. I didn't bring Richard's letter. I didn't have a speech prepared. I just stood there for a while. Thomas used to say something when our business was young and things went wrong. Watch what people do when they think you need them. Back then, he meant vendors, banks, customers. Standing there that afternoon, I realized my second marriage had taught me the other half. Watch what people do when they think they need something from you. Thomas hadn't just left me money. We had spent 32 years learning what money could and couldn't do inside a marriage. We'd argued about it, risked it, saved it, lost some, made more. But neither of us ever treated the other person's consent as an inconvenience. That was the difference. A few weeks after the divorce became final, I stopped at a small cafe outside Columbus on a Saturday morning. I took a table by the window, coffee, 2 eggs, toast, an actual newspaper because I'm 57. and I refused to apologize for certain things. I was halfway through the local section when the waitress came over with the coffee pot. "More, please." She filled my cup, then picked up the extra place setting across from me. "Just one today." I looked at the empty chair. There had been a time after Thomas died when that question would have followed me home. Then Richard came along, and I'd thought having somebody in that chair meant I'd escaped something. Now I knew better. I smiled at her, just me. She took the extra silverware and moved on. I went back to my newspaper, and for the first time in a very long while, the word just didn't sound like something was missing. It sounded like enough. I used to think trust meant having nothing to hide. I don't anymore. Trust is knowing that when somebody discovers what you have, they don't immediately start calculating what part of it should belong to them. Richard lost more than access to my money. He lost the woman who probably would have helped him if he'd simply treated her like his wife. And I learned something, too. Protecting yourself doesn't make you cold. Generosity only means something when it's your choice. If you've ever had somebody mistake your kindness for permission, tell me what you would have done in my place. And if you'd like to stay for another story, I'd be glad to have them. The courtroom doors were still swinging shut behind me when I heard him laugh. Not loud, just a low, satisfied sound, the kind a man makes when he's won something he never should have been fighting for in the first place. I stood on the courthouse steps in my dress blues, $22 in my checking account, and a wedding ring I still hadn't taken off, because some stubborn part of me hadn't caught up with reality yet. 90 seconds later, a stranger in a gray wool coat stopped me on the sidewalk and asked if I was Lieutenant Lucy Price. I said yes. She said my aunt had just died and left me $50 million. Then she said there was a catch. "I want you to understand something before I tell you the rest of this." I didn't cry in that courtroom. 14 years in the Army teaches you how to keep your face still when everything underneath it is on fire. And I'd had a lot of practice by the time Judge Ferris read the final terms of my divorce out loud like she was reading a grocery list. The house gone. Most of our joint savings gone. A settlement figure that made my stomach drop because it wasn't in my favor. It was against me. Like I was the one who'd done something wrong. I sat there in my uniform spine, straight hands folded, and I let the words wash over me, the way you let artillery fire wash over you in a briefing. You don't flinch. You just take the information in, and you figure out how you're going to survive it. Daniel didn't even look at me during most of it. He sat next to Richard Coleman, his lawyer, a man with a $2 Sowens-in suit and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. And the two of them murmured to each other like men closing a business deal, which I understood later was exactly what it was. But that morning, I still thought I was watching my marriage end. I didn't know yet that I was watching the opening move of something much bigger. When the judge finished and it was over, actually over 13 years of my life, reduced to a signature on a piece of paper, I stood up because that's what you do. You stand up, you walk out, you don't let them see you shake. Daniel caught my arm near the door, not hard, just enough to stop me, and he leaned in close enough that I could smell his cologne, the same one he'd worn on our wedding day. And he said, "You always thought being a soldier made you untouchable." I didn't answer him. There wasn't an answer that would have mattered. I just pulled my arm free and walked out into the cold Chicago air like it was any other Tuesday. Even though nothing about that Tuesday was ordinary, I stood on those steps for a minute, just breathing. The sky was that flat gray you get in early spring, the kind that makes the whole city look like it's holding its breath. I remember thinking very clearly that I had exactly $240 to my name if you counted the change in my car's cup holder, and that I was 38 years old and starting over from nothing, and that somehow I was going to have to figure out how to do that with dignity. Because dignity was the only thing left that Daniel hadn't managed to take from me in that room. That's when I noticed her. A woman, maybe 60-65, silver hair pulled back, neat a wool coat that looked like it cost more than my entire wardrobe, standing near the bottom of the steps, like she'd been waiting there specifically for me. She wasn't part of the crowd filing out of the courthouse. She was watching me the way you watch someone you've been sent to find. "Excuse me," she said, stepping forward. "Are you Lieutenant Lucy Price?" I nodded, wary. In my line of work, you learn to be careful about strangers who already know your name and your rank. My name is Margaret Bell, she said. I'm an attorney. I represent the estate of Eleanor Price. She paused, and something in her face softened the practiced compassion of someone who has delivered this kind of news more than once. Your aunt passed away 6 days ago. I felt the ground tilt a little. Eleanor, my father's sister, the aunt in Chicago I hadn't seen in almost 4 years. Not since a wedding that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. We used to talk on the phone less and less, as the years went on, my fault as much as anyone's. The way distance just accumulates quietly until you look up and realize how much time has passed. I hadn't even known she was sick. I'm so sorry, Margaret said, and I believed she meant it. I know this is a difficult day for you already. She glanced just briefly toward the courthouse doors, toward where Daniel and Richard were still standing on the steps above us, and something in that glance told me she knew exactly what had just happened inside that building. Your aunt left you her mansion here in Chicago, she continued, along with an estate valued at nearly $50 million. I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because my brain simply refused to process it as real information. $50 million on the same morning I'd walked out of a courtroom with less than 300. It felt like a cruel joke, like the universe deciding to see how much irony one Tuesday could hold. There is one condition, Margaret said, and her voice changed just slightly, the practiced gentleness, giving way to something more careful, more deliberate. What condition? I asked. She looked past me again toward the courthouse. Steps toward the man I'd just divorced, and the lawyer who'd helped him take almost everything I had. And then she said the words that I would replay in my head for weeks afterward. Words that I didn't understand the full weight of until much, much later. You cannot inherit a single dollar, she said, unless you do exactly what your aunt asked you to do. I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea that the woman standing in front of me was about to hand me a wooden box that would unravel everything I thought I knew about my marriage, about my aunt, and about the very careful, very quiet war that had been waged against me long before I ever stepped foot in that courtroom. To understand why Eleanor's condition mattered so much, I have to take you further back to the beginning of my marriage, because none of what happened outside that courthouse makes sense without it. I met Daniel when I was 26, a young officer with more ambition than sense, and he was charming in a way that felt effortless, the kind of charm that made you feel like the only person in a crowded room. In the early years, he seemed genuinely proud of me. He'd introduced me at parties as my wife, the lieutenant, and there was warmth in it, or at least I believed there was. I was deployed twice in our first 6 years together, and both times he wrote me letters, real ones on paper, which felt old-fashioned and sweet in a way that made the distance easier to bear. But something shifted around year 8. I got promoted. I was given a leadership position that came with more responsibility, more travel, more of my superiors trusting me with things that mattered. And instead of being proud, Daniel started to seem smaller around me. Quieter in a way that wasn't peaceful, it was resentful. He started making comments that were technically jokes, but never quite landed as jokes. You're married to the army, not me, he said once at a dinner with his coworkers, and everyone laughed except me, because I could hear what was underneath it. The control crept in slowly, the way water gets into a foundation, so gradually you don't notice the damage until the whole structure is compromised. He started asking more questions about my income, about my retirement accounts, about the life insurance policy the Army required me to carry. He framed it as concern as a husband being responsible about their shared future. I believed him because why wouldn't I? I trusted him the way you trust someone you've built a decade of your life around. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known, was that somewhere in that same stretch of time, Daniel had quietly begun meeting with Richard Coleman. Not as a friend, as a client. He was building a case against me, before I even knew there was a case to be made. He was documenting things, twisting ordinary moments into evidence, laying groundwork for an ending I hadn't agreed to, and didn't see coming. It was around this time that I called my Aunt Eleanor, mostly just to hear a familiar voice after a rough deployment cycle. Eleanor had a way of listening that made you feel like she was hearing the sentence underneath your sentence. She'd been through a bad marriage herself decades earlier, something she rarely talked about, but that had clearly left her sharp-eyed about the warning signs other people missed. 10 minutes into our call, she stopped me mid-sentence. "Lucy," she said, "are you happy?" "I'm fine." I told her the way women tell people they're fine when they've stopped examining the question too closely because they're afraid of the answer. "That's what women say," Eleanor said quietly, "when they're trying not to admit they're not." I brushed it off. I told her Daniel and I were just going through a hard patch, that marriages have seasons. That this was ours. Eleanor didn't argue with me. But she did something I didn't fully appreciate at the time. She told me to make copies of my financial documents, to know exactly what accounts existed in my name and what existed in his, to never assume that love meant safety. I remember feeling almost defensive on Daniel's behalf, telling her she didn't know him the way I did. She let it go, but she didn't forget it, and neither I would learn did she stop watching. Now, standing outside that courthouse with Margaret Bell in front of me, all of that came rushing back with a different weight to it. Margaret suggested we get somewhere private to talk, and within the hour, I was in the back of a car heading north toward Chicago, watching the city blur past the window while she filled in the parts of the story I didn't know. Eleanor had been sick for almost a year, she told me. Pancreatic cancer diagnosed quietly, treated quietly because that was Eleanor's way. She never wanted anyone fussing over her. And in that final year, knowing her time was limited, she had done something deliberate. She had begun preparing her estate, not just financially, but strategically. She suspected, Margaret said carefully, that my marriage might not survive. She'd seen the signs even from a distance. The way I'd stopped mentioning Daniel in our calls, the way my voice had gotten smaller over the years whenever his name came up. The estate itself was staggering when Margaret laid it out. The mansion in Chicago's Gold Coast, one Eleanor had lived in for over 30 years, shares in a company Eleanor's late husband had built. Investment accounts that had compounded quietly for decades. Real estate holdings scattered across 3 states. A trust fund that, when everything was totaled, came to just under $50 million. But it wasn't mine yet. Not automatically. Margaret explained that Eleanor's will included specific conditions I would need to meet, and the first one was straightforward on its surface. I had to move into the mansion and live there for 12 full months. During that time, I would need to complete a task Eleanor had left for me, something Margaret said she wasn't yet authorized to explain in detail. Instead, she reached into her bag and handed me a small wooden box, worn smooth at the corners, like it had been handled many times, and told me Eleanor had asked that I open it alone when I was ready. Inside, resting on top of what looked like folders and photographs, was a sealed envelope with my name written across it in Eleanor's careful handwriting. I opened it right there in the car. The first line hit me like a physical blow. "My dear Lucy, if you're reading this, the man you married has already shown you who he really is." I looked up at Margaret. She was watching me, with an expression I couldn't quite name, somewhere between sympathy and warning, and I understood in that moment that whatever Eleanor had left me wasn't just an inheritance. It was a message, and I was only just beginning to understand what it was trying to tell me. I didn't read the rest of the letter in the car. Some part of me needed solid ground under my feet first. Needed 4 walls and a locked door before I let myself absorb whatever else Eleanor had left behind. Margaret seemed to understand that without my having to say it. She let the silence sit between us for the remainder of the drive. And when we finally pulled up to the mansion, a limestone building on a quiet tree-lined street that looked like it belonged in a different century, she simply told me to take my time and that she'd be in the study whenever I was ready to talk. I sat alone in what had been Eleanor's sitting room, afternoon light slanting through tall windows, and I opened the box fully for the first time. Beneath the letter were folders neatly labeled in Eleanor's handwriting, copies of emails, financial records I didn't recognize, a handful of photographs, slightly grainy, clearly taken from a distance of Daniel meeting with a man I'd never seen before, in what looked like a hotel lobby. Documents referencing an investment firm I'd never heard my husband mention. And at the bottom, a USB drive, small and unlabeled, sitting there like a quiet accusation. I kept reading Eleanor's letter, and the tone shifted from tender to clinical. The way a woman writes, when she's forcing herself to stay factual about something that terrifies her. She wrote that she hadn't believed, not for a second, that my marriage had simply grown apart. The phrase Daniel had apparently used when he'd last spoken to her. Eleanor had never trusted easy explanations. She'd hired a private investigator almost a year earlier, not out of paranoia, she wrote, but out of something closer to instinct, the kind that comes from having survived her own version of a man who wanted more than he was willing to earn. What the investigator found had confirmed her worst suspicion. Daniel hadn't just been building a divorce case against me. He had also at some point learned about Eleanor. Not casually, deliberately. He'd made inquiries, subtle ones, about her health, about the value of her holdings, about whether she had children of her own who might stand to inherit ahead of me. He had, in other words, known long before I did, that there was a fortune sitting at the end of this story, and he had positioned himself accordingly. I sat very still with that information for a long moment, feeling something cold settle into my chest, and then I remembered it. A memory that had been sitting dormant in the back of my mind for over a year suddenly sharpened into focus. We'd been at dinner maybe 18 months earlier, and Daniel had asked almost offhand, stirring his wine like the question meant nothing. "Your aunt really doesn't have children, does she?" I'd answered without thinking, said no. Eleanor never remarried after her husband passed, no kids. At the time it had seemed like idle curiosity. Now it felt like reconnaissance. Margaret came in partway through my reading, carrying 2 cups of tea. Neither of us touched, and confirmed what the document suggested. Eleanor's investigator had traced a pattern of contact between Daniel and an outside party interested in acquiring property in the neighborhood. Property that included this very mansion. The offers had come in low, well below market value, dressed up as generous. Eleanor had turned them down without much thought at the time, assuming it was simple opportunism. She hadn't yet connected it to her nephew. My phone rang while I was still absorbing all of it. Daniel's name lit up the screen and my stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with grief and everything to do with dread. I almost didn't answer, but some stubborn instinct in me wanted to hear what he'd say, wanted to know how quickly he'd move. "Lucy," he said, his voice carrying that particular warmth he used when he wanted something. "I heard about your aunt. I'm sorry." A pause just long enough to feel calculated. "Whatever she left you, remember that we're still legally tied up financially. Some of those old joint accounts, the settlement terms, it's complicated." "We're divorced, Daniel," I said, keeping my voice as flat and even as I could manage. He laughed softly, the sound of a man who thought he still had the upper hand. "The divorce doesn't erase everything," he said. I hung up without responding, my hand shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the sudden sharp clarity of understanding exactly what he was doing. He wasn't calling to grieve with me. He was calling to stake a claim before the ink on the will had even dried testing. Whether there was still a door left open, he could push through. I went back to Eleanor's letter, and near the end, her handwriting grew smaller, more deliberate, like she'd been choosing every word with care. "Don't fight him with anger, Lucy," she'd written. "Fight him with proof," and then underlined twice. Do not tell Daniel anything about what is in this box. Not yet. Let him believe you know nothing." I sat with that instruction for a while, understanding for the first time that my aunt hadn't just left me money, she'd left me a strategy. That night, alone in the mansion study, I finally plugged the USB drive into an old laptop Margaret had left for me. A video file loaded, and Eleanor's face appeared on the screen, thinner than I remembered, sitting in this same room, speaking directly into the camera, with the steady composure that had defined her entire life. "Lucy," she said, her voice a little rougher than I remembered, but unmistakably hers. "If Daniel ever contacts you after my death, do not trust him." She paused, and something flickered across her face, something that looked almost like fear. which was strange to see on a woman I'd never once seen rattled. Because he isn't the only person you need to worry about. The video ended there. The room went quiet except for the soft hum of the old radiator and the sound of my own heartbeat, which felt suddenly very loud in my ears. I sat in the dark for a long time after that, staring at the frozen last frame of my aunt's face, understanding that whatever was coming next was bigger than a bitter ex-husband trying to claw back what he'd already lost. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the laptop open on the desk beside me, Eleanor's frozen face still on the screen, and I went through every document in that box until the sun came up over the lake. By morning, I had a legal pad covered in names, dates, and connections, the same way I used to build intelligence briefings back when I was still in uniform, treating my own marriage like a case file, because that was the only way I could keep my hands from shaking while I worked. Margaret and I sat down together in the study once she arrived, and we went through it, piece by piece. The photographs of Daniel meeting the unfamiliar man turned out to be more significant than I'd first understood. Margaret recognized the man immediately from a separate set of records Eleanor's investigator had compiled. His name was Grant Whitfield, and he ran a small but aggressive real estate acquisition firm that specialized in exactly the kind of undervalued, high-potential properties that made up a good portion of Eleanor's estate, including this mansion. What made my stomach turn wasn't just that Daniel had met with him. Snorts. It was who had introduced them. Richard Coleman, my ex-husband's divorce attorney, the same man who had stood beside Daniel in that courtroom looking so satisfied with himself, had financial ties to Whitfield's firm. Margaret found records of consulting fees small enough to seem unremarkable on their own, but consistent, going back nearly 2 years. Here is what I started to understand, sitting in that study with the morning light coming through the tall windows. The divorce hadn't just been Daniel deciding he no longer wanted to be married to me. It had been the opening move in something larger. Push me out of the marriage while I still had assets worth fighting over. Weaken me financially and emotionally right as I was approaching what would eventually be a $50 million inheritance. And then, once I was disoriented and depleted, apply pressure to sell or sign away pieces of what I'd inherited before I fully understood their value. It was almost elegant in its cruelty. Divorce me first, so that by the time Eleanor's estate came into play, I'd be too exhausted, too financially strained, too eager for stability to think clearly about what I was signing. Eleanor, it turned out, had seen pieces of this coming long before I did. Margaret showed me records of a lowball offer Eleanor had received on the mansion nearly a year earlier. An offer she'd waved off at the time, as nothing more than an aggressive real estate agent testing the waters. She hadn't known then that it traced back to Whitfield, and through him to Richard, and through Richard to the man I was still on paper tangled up with financially. I remember sitting very still after Margaret laid all of this out, feeling something shift inside my chest, a kind of cold, clear resolve, replacing the numbness I'd been carrying since the courthouse. I had spent 13 years married to the man I thought I understood. And it was only now in the wreckage of that marriage that I was starting to see the actual architecture of what had been built around me the whole time. I want to be honest with you about something. There was a version of me that morning that wanted to call Daniel and scream at him, wanted to drive to wherever he was and demand to know how long he'd been planning this, how much of our marriage had been real, and how much had simply been reconnaissance. But Eleanor's voice kept coming back to me. Fight him with proof, not anger. And underneath that, something else. Something that felt like the version of myself I'd built in uniform. The officer who didn't react, who gathered information first and acted second. So instead of confronting anyone, I started building. I requested full account histories on anything connected to my marriage. I asked Margaret to bring in a forensic accountant. I began constructing a timeline cross-referencing dates from Daniel's emails against dates from the divorce proceedings, looking for the exact moment his behavior had shifted from a man drifting away from his marriage to a man actively engineering its collapse. It was during this process that Margaret introduced me to Sam Carter, a former financial investigator who had worked with Eleanor for years, and who, it turned out, Eleanor had specifically asked to be available to me if I ever needed him. Sam was in his 50s, quiet, the kind of person who listened twice as much as he spoke, and within an hour of meeting him, I understood why Eleanor had trusted him. Sam told me something that changed the entire shape of what I was dealing with. Eleanor, anticipating exactly this kind of scenario, had built protective language into the trust itself, a kind of legal tripwire. If anyone Daniel Richard Whitfield or anyone acting on their behalf attempted to pressure me into selling, transferring, or compromising the estate within that first 12-month window, specific clauses in the trust would automatically trigger clauses that would not only protect the assets, but would expose exactly who had attempted to interfere. My aunt, it turned out, hadn't just left me money. She'd left me a trap built with the same patience and precision she'd used to build everything else in her life. And she'd built it specifically with Daniel in mind, even if she'd never had the chance to prove exactly what he'd done. Then Sam handed me one more piece of evidence, something Eleanor's investigator had obtained in the final weeks before her death. An audio recording a conversation between Daniel and Richard. The two of them speaking with the kind of casual confidence men have when they don't think anyone else is listening. I sat in that study, and I listened to my ex-husband's voice come through the speaker calm, almost pleased with himself. Once she gets the inheritance, he said, she'll have nowhere left to run. I didn't cry when I heard it. I didn't feel the urge to. Something in me had already moved past the grief of that sentence and into something steadier, something that felt for the first time since I'd walked out of that courthouse, like the ground under my feet again. Then let's see, I said quietly to no one in particular, where they run when the truth comes out. I want to tell you something about how I was trained to fight because it matters for what happened next. In the army, they don't teach you to charge in swinging. They teach you patience. They teach you that the person who moves first out of anger usually loses. And the person who waits, who watches, who lets the other side reveal their hand, that person walks away standing. That was the lesson I carried into the weeks that followed. And it was the lesson that let me sit across from Daniel and Richard and let them believe for a little while longer that I was exactly as lost and desperate as they wanted me to be. I stopped returning Daniel's calls right away. I let a day pass, then too long enough that when I finally did pick up, my voice sounded tired and uncertain, which wasn't entirely an act. Some of it was real. But I let him hear more of it than there actually was. He softened immediately the way people do when they think they found a crack to work with. He told me he was worried about me. He said he just wanted to make sure I wasn't overwhelmed by everything happening with the estate. That inheritance law was complicated, that he'd hate to see me make a mistake I couldn't undo. Around the same time, Richard sent a formal letter to Margaret's office, warning that certain debts from the marriage debts I knew for a fact had already been settled in the divorce might still attach to any new assets I acquired. It was legally shaky at best, the kind of letter designed to frighten rather than to hold up in court. But it was calculated to make me feel cornered, to make me reach for the nearest hand offering help. I let them think it worked. I agreed to meet Daniel alone at a coffee shop not far from the mansion. He picked the place, which told me something to a location he was comfortable in, somewhere he thought he had the advantage. I dressed plainly. I let my hands look a little unsteady around the coffee cup. I let him talk first. "We can settle this between us," he said, leaning forward with that same warmth he used to use on me back when I still believed it meant something. "No lawyers, no more courtrooms, just us figuring it out like adults." "What do you want, Daniel?" I asked him. He said he only wanted to make sure we were both protected. That with an estate this size, there were tax implications, liability issues, things I might not have thought through on my own, and that he'd feel better if we came to some kind of private arrangement before things got, in his words, more complicated. What Daniel didn't know was that I wasn't just sitting there listening. On the advice of my legal team, I was recording every word of that conversation, through a device Margaret had arranged entirely within the law, entirely admissible. And Daniel, comfortable and a little too pleased with how well he thought this was going, made a mistake. He referenced Eleanor's declining health, referenced it with specific detail, timelines that lined up almost perfectly with the private investigator's findings, timelines that he could only have known if he'd been actively tracking her condition. Well before her death. Long before I ever mentioned to him that she was sick, because the truth was I never had. I hadn't known myself until Margaret told me at the courthouse. I kept my face still. 14 years of training held. But inside, something clicked into place with the finality of a lock turning. Around that same time, Margaret's team uncovered something equally damning on Richard's end. Some of the documents he'd used in his aggressive letters, references to specific account numbers, specific dates tied to Eleanor's trust structure information that simply wasn't public, and that Richard had no legitimate way of accessing unless someone had handed it to him directly. It didn't take much imagining to guess who that someone was. It raised serious questions. Questions about conflicts of interest, about whether Richard had crossed lines that could cost him his license, about whether what we were looking at wasn't just a bitter divorce anymore, but something that edged into conspiracy. I stopped feeling like a victim somewhere in the middle of all this, though I couldn't tell you the exact day it happened. It wasn't dramatic. It was more like waking up gradually and realizing the fear that had been sitting on my chest for weeks had quietly lifted while I wasn't paying attention. I started using a portion of the funds I was legally entitled to draw from the trust, modest amounts carefully documented, to build a legal team of my own people who answered to me, and no one else. I hired a forensic auditor to go through every transaction connected to Daniel over the past 3 years. I began protecting the mansion itself, formalizing security, making sure nothing else disappeared the way I feared it eventually might. But the full $50 million still wasn't mine. Not yet, and it was around this time that Margaret sat me down and told me the second half of Eleanor's condition, the part she said Eleanor had asked her to withhold until I'd proven I could handle the first half with a clear head. Eleanor had established a charitable fund years earlier, quietly without fanfare, supporting women transitioning out of difficult marriages, and more specifically women in military service, who often fell through the cracks of both worlds. The condition was this: I had to protect that fund, actively as part of fulfilling the terms of the will. If I sold the mansion or abandoned the process before the 12 months were up, everything, the estate, the trust, all of it would pass directly to the fund instead of to me. Sitting there, I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before. This had never only been about money. Eleanor wasn't just testing whether I could survive Daniel and Richard, and whatever they were building against me. She was testing whether I would become the kind of woman she'd always believed I could be. Someone who used strength, not just for her own protection, but for something larger than herself. That understanding was still settling over me a few nights later, when I walked into the study to find the door slightly ajar the way I never left it. The wooden box was still sitting exactly where I'd left it on the desk, but the USB drive, the one that held Eleanor's recorded warning, the one piece of evidence I hadn't yet duplicated, was gone. Fan 6 Su that truck Kong Chong. I didn't panic when I found the USB gone. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't bravery. Not exactly. It was preparation. Somewhere in the back of my mind, ever since Eleanor's letter had told me not to trust anyone completely, not even the walls of my own house, I'd asked Margaret to make an encrypted digital copy of everything on that drive the very first week I had it. The original sitting in that wooden box had become, without my even fully planning it that way, a kind of bait. Whoever had taken it thought they'd taken the only proof that existed. They were wrong. Still, someone had been inside the mansion. That fact alone kept me up that night, walking through the halls of a house I was still getting used to, calling mine, checking locks that were already locked, listening to the old radiators tick and settle, like the building itself was breathing. In the morning, Sam Carter came by, and together we pulled the footage from the security cameras Margaret had quietly installed around the property not long after I'd moved in. A precaution Eleanor herself had apparently requested be arranged the moment the will was finalized. The footage was grainy but usable. A figure face partially obscured, moving through the side entrance late at night. Familiar enough with the layout of the house to head straight for the study without hesitation. Sam ran the timestamp against phone records we'd already gathered as part of the broader investigation, and the trail led, not surprisingly anymore, back to someone connected to Richard's office. It wasn't Daniel himself in the footage, but it didn't need to be. The connection was enough. We turned everything over to the authorities at that point. The footage, the encrypted files, the financial records Sam and the forensic accountant had spent weeks assembling. I remember sitting in Margaret's office while she made the calls, feeling strangely calm. The way you feel calm in the middle of a mission, when all the planning finally gives way to execution, and there's nothing left to do but let the process unfold. Daniel, as far as we could tell, still believed the USB theft had worked, that he and Richard had successfully removed the one piece of evidence that could truly hurt them. He grew bolder in the weeks that followed, sending more requests through Richard for financial consideration, framing himself in conversations with mutual acquaintances as a man who'd been left behind by a wife, too consumed with a sudden fortune to remember the years they'd shared. It might have worked on someone who didn't know what I knew. It didn't work on me, and it wouldn't work on the people who were about to see the evidence for themselves. A hearing was eventually scheduled, prompted by the legal complaint Margaret's team filed regarding Richard's conduct and the broader pattern of interference with Eleanor's estate. Daniel showed up looking exactly like a man who still believed he held the better hand. Dressed, sharp, composed, ready to play the part of the wronged husband one more time. I watched him settle into his seat with that same practiced ease he'd carried into our divorce hearing months earlier, and for just a moment, I felt the old flicker of doubt, that small voice asking whether any of this would actually matter, whether people like Daniel simply always found a way to land on their feet. Then my legal team began presenting the evidence, and I watched that composure start to come apart in real time. They laid out the timeline first, the inquiries Daniel had made about Eleanor's health and holdings long before her death, the meetings with Grant Whitfield, the financial ties between Whitfield and Richard's firm. Then came the audio recording, Daniel's own voice filling the room flat and confident, saying that once I got the inheritance, I'd have nowhere left to run. Clear's throat. I watched several people in that room shift in their seats when they heard it. Watched the color drain slightly from Richard's face as he realized exactly how much had been documented, how much he'd allowed himself to believe would never surface. Richard tried to argue procedure, tried to suggest the recordings had been obtained improperly. But Margaret had been meticulous, every step handled within the boundaries of the law. Every piece of evidence gathered in ways that would hold up to exactly this kind of scrutiny. I could see it on his face the moment he understood. There was no clever objection left to make no version of this hearing where he walked out with his reputation intact. I didn't say much during any of it. I didn't need to. There's a particular kind of satisfaction quieter than I expected, in watching the truth do the work you once thought only anger could do. I'd spent so many nights in the early weeks after the divorce imagining confrontations, imagining the things I'd say to Daniel if I ever got the chance. And none of those imagined speeches came close to the weight of simply sitting still while evidence dismantled his version of events, piece by piece. After the hearing out in the hallway, Daniel caught up to me one more time. Something in his posture had changed. The confidence gone slack, replaced by something almost bewildered, like a man trying to understand how a plan that had seemed so solid could have failed so completely. "Why didn't you just tell me about the inheritance?" he asked, and there was something almost wounded in his voice, as if I owed him an explanation. I looked at him for a long moment before I answered, thinking about Eleanor's letter about the months of quiet work it had taken to get to this exact hallway, this exact conversation. "Because you taught me something," I said. "What?" he asked. "Never give someone the map to the treasure," I said, "after they tried to steal your compass." I walked away from him without waiting to see his reaction. I didn't need to see it. For the first time since I'd walked out of that courthouse with nothing, I felt like I was walking towards something instead of away from it. And that difference I was beginning to understand was going to matter more than any number on a bank statement ever could. Fan 7J Eleanor Thuck Suj Lai. The 12 months passed slower than I expected in some ways, and faster than I could have imagined in others. There were quiet mornings in that mansion when I'd walk through rooms Eleanor had once filled with her presence, running my hand along furniture she'd chosen decades earlier, feeling less like an heir moving into someone else's life, and more like a woman slowly growing into the shape of who she was meant to become. There were also hard months. Months of depositions and legal filings, of watching Richard's law license come under formal review, of learning just how far Daniel and Richard had been willing to go before they were finally stopped. But I made it through one deliberate day at a time, the same way I'd made it through deployments, the same way Eleanor, I suspected, had made it through whatever had shaped her into the woman who built a legal trap this precise, from beyond the grave. When the 12 months finally ended, Margaret sat with me in Eleanor's study, the same room where I'd first opened that wooden box and confirmed that every condition of the will had been met. I had lived in the mansion for the full year. I had protected the charitable fund, not just preserved it, but actually grown it, working with Sam and a small team to expand its reach in ways I don't think even Eleanor had anticipated. The estate transferred to me fully and formally through the trust. Nearly $50 million, a number that still didn't feel entirely real, even as I signed the paperwork that made it official. But I need you to understand that the money wasn't the part that broke me open that day. It was the final letter. Margaret had been holding it per Eleanor's instructions to be delivered only once every condition had been satisfied. Only once she was certain I'd actually walked the entire path rather than simply inherited the destination. I opened it alone that evening, sitting in the same chair where I'd first read her handwriting all those months ago, and this time her words felt less like a warning and more like an embrace. She wrote that she'd known long before I did, that I would face a moment where it felt like I'd lost everything that mattered. She wrote that she'd lived through her own version of that moment decades earlier. A marriage that had tried to convince her she was worth less than she was, and that watching me walk that same road, even from a distance, even through infrequent phone calls and the occasional worried instinct, had broken her heart in a way she'd never fully told me while she was alive. She wanted me to understand something specific, something she underlined twice in her careful handwriting. Losing a marriage does not mean losing your worth. She hadn't left me this fortune so that I could punish Daniel, so that I could build some elaborate revenge and call it justice. She'd left it to me so that I would never again have to make a decision, financial or otherwise, out of fear, so that I would never sit across from a man who wanted to diminish me and feel like I had no choice but to accept it. Daniel in the end lost far more than he gained. Every advantage he tried to claw out of our divorce evaporated once the truth of his conduct came to light. The legal consequences for Richard continued unfolding for months afterward, his firm's reputation collapsing under the weight of what the investigation uncovered: his partnership with Whitfield, exposed in ways that closed doors he'd spent years opening. Daniel, I heard eventually through snorts, the kind of second-hand channels that always seem to carry this news, whether you want them to or not, had moved out of state, starting over in a much smaller life than the one he'd tried to engineer for himself. I think about that moment on the courthouse steps. Sometimes the man who told me I always thought being a soldier made me untouchable, as if that had been an insult, instead of the truest thing anyone had said about me in years. He thought I was walking away with nothing. He had no idea that walking away with nothing was exactly the moment my life actually began. I stood at the window of the mansion on my last evening before the anniversary officially passed, looking out over the Chicago skyline, my old dress uniform hanging pressed and ready in the closet behind me, a photograph of Eleanor sitting on the desk where I could see her every time I looked up from my work. I spoke out loud, even though there was no one else in the room, because some things need to be said even when no one's there to hear them. You were right, Aunt Eleanor, I said. I didn't need revenge. I needed the truth. In the months that followed, I used part of the estate to expand Eleanor's fund. Significantly. Building it into something that could reach further than either of us had originally imagined. Support for women transitioning out of military service. Support for women leaving controlling marriages. Emergency financial assistance for military families, facing the kind of quiet, invisible hardship that so rarely makes headlines. It felt like the truest way to honor what she'd actually left me. Not the number in the bank account, but the responsibility that came with it. I walked out of that mansion on a clear morning, not long after the first genuinely warm day of spring. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I didn't look back over my shoulder on my way out the door. Daniel had taken almost everything he could get his hands on, but he never touched the one thing that actually mattered. And he never would. The inheritance wasn't the biggest gift my aunt ever gave me. The biggest gift was that I finally understood exactly what I was worth. And no courtroom, no ex-husband, and no amount of betrayal would ever be able to take that away from me again. If this story moved you, I want to know where it found you. Drop a comment below and tell me what part hit you the hardest. Because stories like Lucy's remind us that the people who try to make us feel small rarely understand what we're capable of rebuilding. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you. So, make sure you subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Let's keep this journey going. The night my sister became a partner, my father looked me in the eye and told a room full of strangers that I still served in the army, like it was a disease I hadn't recovered from yet. 20 minutes later, a 2-star general crossed that ballroom, shook my hand, and said 4 words that turned every head in the room. Major Caldwell, good evening. My brother-in-law's face went white. My sister's champagne glass stopped halfway to her lips. My father just stood there staring at me like he'd never seen me before in his life. But to understand why that moment mattered, you have to go back 8 years to the dinner where my father told me not to come home unless I'd failed. I was 24 years old, standing in my parents' dining room, watching my father raise a glass of red wine to my sister like she'd just cured cancer instead of landing her first job out of law school. A toast, he said, and his voice had that particular warmth he saved for moments he wanted remembered. To Rebecca, someday she's going to make partner. Everyone clapped. My mother, who passed 2 years before that, would have clapped loudest. I clapped too, because I loved my sister, and I still believed back then that there was enough room in that family for 2 kinds of pride. Then it was my turn to share news, and I made the mistake of thinking my father wanted to hear it. I told them I'd decided to commission as an officer, that I'd been accepted, that I was leaving for training in 6 weeks, that I'd thought about this for over a year, and I was certain. The room went quiet in a way that still lives somewhere in my chest. My father laughed first, a short, disbelieving laugh like I'd told a joke he hadn't quite caught the punchline of. When he realized I was serious, the laugh disappeared, and something colder took its place. You have a college degree, he said. Like that fact alone should have made the army unthinkable. Like a degree was a passport out of anything difficult, and I'd chosen to hand mine back. I tried to explain. I told him I wanted a career that meant something that demanded something real from me, that I didn't want to spend my life behind a desk, wondering if I'd ever actually been tested. He wasn't listening. I could see it in his eyes. He'd already sorted us into 2 boxes before I finished the sentence. Rebecca successful, Teresa throwing her life away. Rebecca laughed too, not unkindly, but not kindly either. Well, she said, swirling her wine, at least you won't have to worry about picking out work outfits every morning. The table laughed with her. I remember smiling because I didn't know what else to do with my face. I didn't argue that night. I've never been much for arguing in rooms where I already know I've lost. But before I left for training, my father walked me to my car, and instead of a hug or a good luck, he said the sentence that would live in me for the next 8 years. Don't come back here when you fail. I looked at him for a long moment. I wanted to ask him what exactly he thought failure would look like. A discharge, A broken body, a phone call he'd have to explain to his girlfriends. But I didn't ask. I just said, "I'll remember you said that," and got in my car. I didn't turn it into a war. I could have screamed. Could have told him exactly what I thought of a father who measured his daughters by which one made him look good at dinner parties. Instead, I drove away and let the silence between us start growing, the way silence does when nobody tends to it. What followed was 8 years most people never get to see. Not the highlight reel, the actual weight of it. Mornings that started in the dark. Packing lists memorized by muscle memory. Moving to a new post before I'd even unpacked from the last one. Learning to function on 4 hours of sleep because the mission didn't care how tired I was. Being handed responsibility for people's safety, for equipment worth more than my father's entire business, for decisions that didn't come with a dover button. I grew into a version of myself that nobody at that dinner table would have recognized as steadier, harder in the ways that mattered, softer in the ways that surprised even me. And every time I called home, my father asked the same question in the same tired tone, like he was checking on a phase he assumed I'd eventually grow out of. "So, when are you going to find a real job?" I stopped explaining after the third or fourth call. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from defending your life to someone who's already decided not to believe you. I let them believe what they wanted to believe. It was easier than bleeding for their approval every single time we spoke. 8 years is a long time to carry a sentence like the one my father gave me. Long enough that I almost stopped hearing it. Almost. Then on an ordinary Tuesday, a thick cream-colored envelope showed up in my mailbox, formal heavy cardstock gold lettering. The kind of invitation that cost someone real money to print. Inside was a request for my presence at a celebration Rebecca had made partner. Exactly the future my father had toasted to 8 years earlier, arriving right on schedule. But when I turned the envelope over to see who'd sent it, the name on the return address wasn't my father's. And it wasn't my sister's either. The name on the envelope belonged to my Aunt Margaret, my father's younger sister, the one person in that family who never let 8 years of silence turn into 8 years of forgetting me. Margaret was past 60 by then, sharp as ever, with the kind of directness that used to embarrass my father at holidays. She was the only one who called on my birthday without me having to remind anyone it was coming. Inside the invitation, she'd tucked a small note in her own handwriting, the ink slightly smudged like she'd written it in a hurry before she lost her nerve. "You're still a Caldwell," it said. "Don't let them make you forget that." My first instinct was to decline, not out of spite, out of something closer to self-preservation. I didn't want to walk into a room built entirely around celebrating my sister and somehow become the story of the night. I didn't want to give my father the satisfaction of watching me hover at the edges of a success he never imagined I'd have to witness up close. Margaret called before I could write back my regrets. She didn't ask how I was doing. She got straight to it the way she always did. She told me my father had spent weeks telling anyone who'd listen that one of my kids really knows how to make something of her life. She said it slow, so I'd catch exactly which kid he meant. I already knew. Then she asked me the question that actually changed my mind. "How many more years are you going to keep avoiding a room just because they happen to be standing in it?" I didn't have an answer for her, so I said I'd go. While I was making that decision on the other side of the family, my sister's husband was doing what he always did, holding court. Daniel Hayashad, a gift for turning any social gathering into an opportunity to remind people what he did for a living. Vice President of Business Development at Egypt Meridian Solutions, a company that supplied logistics services and equipment under government contracts. He liked dropping phrases like Pentagon clients and 8-figure contracts into conversations that had nothing to do with either. My father ate it up every time. To my father, Daniel represented everything. He respected a man in a good suit closing deals with the government, shaking hands that mattered. He used to introduce Daniel at parties with real pride in his voice. Daniel works directly with the military at a pretty high level. The irony never seemed to occur to him that a man selling services to the military somehow impressed him more than his own daughter, who'd spent 8 years serving in it. Rebecca had absorbed that same blind spot without questioning it. In her mind, I was still the sister who'd wasted a perfectly good degree, chasing something none of them understood. But there was something happening in my life that none of them knew about, something I hadn't mentioned to a single member of my family, not even Margaret. For the past several months, I'd been part of a working group reviewing certain issues tied to contract performance and procurement compliance routine, oversight work, the unglamorous backbone of what I actually did in logistics. And a name had crossed my desk more than once in recent weeks, buried in paperwork nobody outside a very small circle was supposed to be discussing yet. Aegis Meridian Solutions, Daniel's company. I want to be honest about what I knew and didn't know, because the truth is more interesting than the version where I secretly had my brother-in-law under a magnifying glass. I hadn't personally investigated Daniel. I didn't have some file with his name circled in red, but I knew the company was under scrutiny. I knew certain records had been flagged and pushed up the chain for closer review. I didn't yet know how deep Daniel's fingerprints went into whatever mess was unfolding. What I did know was enough to make me very careful about what I said and to whom and when. I told no one in my family. Not because I was protecting Daniel. I owed him nothing, but because I understood the difference between what I knew professionally and what I had any right to discuss at a dinner party. That line mattered to me, even if nobody else in that family had ever bothered to draw one. The night of the celebration, I stood in front of my closet for longer than I want to admit, finally choosing a simple dark dress instead of anything that even hinted at a uniform. I wanted to walk into that ballroom as somebody's little sister. Not as an officer, not as anyone with rank or files or clearance, just Teresa. The hotel lobby was all marble and soft gold light. The kind of place that made you lower your voice without being told to. A young woman at a check-in table ran her finger down a printed guest list, searching for my name. When she found it, she paused just slightly, just long enough for me to notice. "Caldwell," she said, glancing up. "Teresa Caldwell?" I nodded. She smiled, but there was something careful in it, something I couldn't quite place yet. "Someone's expecting you," she said, and gestured toward the ballroom doors, like she knew something I didn't. I had no idea walking through those doors just how right she was. Margaret found me before I found her, cutting through the crowd in a deep green dress, arms already open. We hugged longer than either of us probably intended to, the kind of hug that says more than a phone call ever could. Over her shoulder, I took in the room, a ballroom dressed in soft gold light, round tables draped in white, a string quartet somewhere near the back, doing its quiet work under all the conversation. Rebecca's colleagues were there, other partners from the firm, corporate clients in expensive suits and scattered among them. My father's circle of old friends, the ones who'd known us since we were girls. I saw my father before he saw me. He was standing near the center of the room, holding court the way he always did, one hand resting on some stranger's shoulder, laughing at his own joke. Then his eyes moved past the stranger and landed on me, and I watched his whole face change in real time. The smile didn't fade slowly, it just stopped. He crossed the room toward me, and for one absurd second I let myself hope he might hug me. He didn't. No embrace, no handshake, not even a nod. Just 4 words, flat and cold. "Who invited you?" "Aunt Margaret," I said, keeping my voice even. He turned to glare at his sister, and I watched Margaret meet that look without flinching, the way only someone who's known a person their whole life can. Then Rebecca appeared beside him, stunning in deep blue arms crossing over her chest before she'd even said hello. "Teresa, tonight is about my career." "I know," I said. "Then why are you here?" "To congratulate you." She looked me over top to bottom, the way you'd size up someone who'd wandered into the wrong wedding. Then she said, quiet enough that it was meant to be private, but loud enough that the people nearest us heard it anyway. "She doesn't belong here." My father said nothing. That silence hurt more than anything either of them could have said out loud. Somebody nearby asked him out of polite curiosity what I did for a living. He answered before I could open my mouth. "She's still in the army." The way he leaned on that word still made it sound less like a fact, and more like an apology he was making on my behalf. The guest, undeterred, asked what exactly I did over there, I kept it simple. I'm an officer. My father cut back in almost immediately. Anyway, Rebecca's the one we're celebrating tonight. Nobody argued with that. I certainly didn't. 8 years teaches you something about which battles are worth the air it takes to fight them. And a stranger's cocktail hour, curiosity, wasn't one of mine. That's when Daniel walked over phone, pressed to his ear, voice low and tight, in a way that didn't match the celebratory mood of the room. I caught fragments as he approached review documentation contracting office before he ended the call and slid the phone into his jacket. He looked up, saw me standing there, and his expression soured instantly. Rebecca filled the silence for him. My sister just showed up. Daniel, already wound tight from whatever call he just ended, turned that tension straight at me. Why the hell would you show up here? A few heads turned. I felt the room's attention shift. That particular hush that happens right before people pretend not to be listening. I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and understood something in that moment that none of them did yet. He had no idea who I actually was. I let myself smile just slightly. You don't know anything, do you? Daniel opened his mouth to fire something back, but before a single word made it out, a voice cut through the noise behind me, deep and unmistakably military in its cadence. Major Caldwell. Daniel froze mid-birth, his mouth still half open around whatever he'd been about to say. The voice belonged to Brigadier General Thomas Whitaker, a 2-star I'd worked alongside years earlier on a logistics assignment that taught me more in 6 months than most jobs teach in 6 years. His wife had apparently once been a client at Rebecca's firm, which explained his presence in a ballroom I never expected to find him in. He crossed toward me with the easy confidence of a man used to rooms rearranging themselves around him and extended his hand. I had no idea you'd be here tonight, he said. Neither did I, General, I answered, shaking his hand. Not about you, anyway. My father went completely still. I watched it happen out of the corner of my eye, the color draining slightly from his face, his jaw tightening like he was trying to solve a math problem that refused to add up. Rebecca's expression shifted to confusion, replacing irritation. Major, she said quietly, almost to herself. She hadn't known. In 8 years, she'd never once asked what rank I held, and I'd never once volunteered it. My father, still trying to catch up, turned to the nearest person. What does Major mean exactly? A man standing a few feet away, someone who'd clearly served himself, judging by the quiet certainty in his voice, answered before I could. 04. My father blinked, still lost. The man clarified further, kindly but plainly. Your daughter's a field-grade officer, he said it. The way you'd explained something obvious to someone who should have known it already. I watched the air in that little circle change. People who'd barely registered my presence 10 minutes earlier were suddenly looking at me differently, recalibrating something in real time. I didn't enjoy it the way I might have imagined I would years ago, lying awake after another phone call where my father asked when I'd find a real job. Mostly, I just kept talking to Whitaker like none of it mattered, because in the ways that counted, it didn't. His opinion of me had never needed correcting. Whitaker asked, casual and familiar, still doing logistics oversight work. Yes, sir, I said. Daniel heard it. I watched the words land on him like a physical weight. Logistics oversight, and something behind his eyes shifted from irritation into something closer to alarm. Where exactly do you work? He asked, and his voice had lost its earlier edge, replaced by something more careful. I looked at him steadily. You really want to ask me that here? He didn't answer. Rebecca, sensing the temperature of the conversation had changed without understanding why, looked between us. What is going on? Nobody answered her either. Whitaker glanced toward Daniel, something calculating passing behind his eyes. And I made the introduction because avoiding it would have looked stranger than making it. This is Daniel Hayes, my sister's husband. Whitaker repeated the name slowly, like he was searching a mental file. Hayes. A pause, then something settled into place behind his expression, and Daniel's face went the color of the tablecloths. I understood exactly what had happened, even without being told directly. Whitaker's name sat somewhere in the chain of oversight, connected to a program Daniel's company was currently trying very hard to protect. I hadn't set out to expose anything that night. I hadn't even planned on Whitaker being in the room, but I recognized the particular kind of fear that crossed Daniel's face. The fear of a man realizing the walls of his carefully built world had just gotten a lot thinner. I didn't press it. I wasn't there to corner him in front of a room full of his wife's colleagues. "Daniel," I said, quiet enough that it stayed between us. "Work talk can wait until tomorrow." If I'd meant it as mercy, it didn't land that way. His face told me the opposite, that my restraint confirmed the one thing he'd been afraid of since the moment he heard my name attached to a rank he clearly hadn't expected. I already knew. After the toasts wrapped up and Rebecca finished her speech, gracious, polished, exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd spent a career learning to command a room, Daniel found a way to pull me aside into a quieter corner near the bar. Rebecca followed close behind, her champagne forgotten somewhere on a table. Daniel didn't waste time on pleasantries. "How much do you know about what I asked?" Though I understood exactly what he meant. "Don't play that game with me." I kept my voice level. "Then you should probably be specific about what you're worried." I know what came out over the next several minutes wasn't a confession exactly, more a slow unraveling. Aegis Meridian had come under scrutiny over certain performance certifications and subcontractors' disclosures tied to one of their logistics contracts. I wasn't a criminal investigator. I had no authority to cancel a contract on my own, no power to hand down verdicts from some corner office. But in the course of my actual job, I'd flagged numerical inconsistencies in documentation that had crossed my desk, and I'd routed the concern through the proper channels the way anyone in my position was required to. From there, it had made its way to contracting officials and the appropriate oversight bodies. That was the whole of my involvement, doing my job correctly, the way I'd been trained to. Daniel had known a review was underway. What he hadn't known until tonight was that I'd been one of the people who first noticed the numbers didn't add up. Rebecca stood there absorbing all of it, and I watched something crack behind her composed exterior. She turned to her husband. "You told me it was a routine audit." "It is," Daniel said too quickly. "Then why do you look terrified?" He didn't answer that either. This was where the second layer of the night revealed itself. Rebecca admitted quietly that her firm had recently been approached by Daniel to assist his company with certain compliance matters. If Daniel had knowingly withheld material information from anyone, the firm, the contracting office, his own wife, it wasn't just his career on the line. It could create serious professional exposure for Rebecca too, someone whose name and new title were now tied to his company through the very connection he'd arranged. I watched my sister begin to understand in real time that her husband might have been using her reputation and her new position as cover. I kept my own boundaries clear. I'm not going to discuss case files with either of you. If his company receives an official request, they answer it through the proper process. That's it. Daniel's fear curdled into anger. "Are you threatening me?" "No," I said. "I'm telling you the exact opposite. I'm not going to use my family to interfere with my job. That's not how this works, and it's not who I am." That's when my father walked into the middle of it, catching only the tail end of the exchange. True to 8 years of habit, he immediately positioned himself beside Rebecca without asking a single question first. "Teresa, that's enough. This is your sister's night." I looked at him. "Do you even know what's happening right now?" "I know you're ruining a party." Something in me went quiet, and still the way it does right before you accept a truth you've been circling for a long time. "So 8 years hasn't changed anything." I said. He didn't answer that. He didn't need to. His silence was the answer, the same one he'd been giving me since I was 24 years old, standing in his dining room, waiting for him to understand that choosing a hard life wasn't the same as choosing a failed one. Daniel's composure didn't survive much longer after that. He turned on me, accusing me of showing up that night specifically to humiliate him in front of his wife's colleagues, his voice rising just enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby tables. Margaret didn't let that stand for a second. "I invited her," she said, stepping in close enough that Daniel had to look at her instead of me. My father rounded on his sister. "You shouldn't have done that." Margaret didn't blink. "Why not?" "Because she's his daughter." "Don't turn this into." "You turned this into something 8 years ago." Margaret said, cutting him off clean. That was the moment old wounds finally split open in front of everyone. Margaret told them things I'd never bothered mentioning myself. The birthday cards I'd sent every single year, the Christmas gifts, the phone calls home that never once stopped, no matter how little warmth came back through the line. She told them how my father used to explain my absence to people by saying I was off playing soldier. Like 8 years of my life amounted to a hobby he found mildly embarrassing. I'd never told anyone that story. I hadn't needed the sympathy of a room to carry it. Rebecca stood there taking it in, and I watched something shift behind her eyes. The beginning of a realization that she'd spent years absorbing our father's version of me without once asking what my actual life looked like. Then Daniel's phone buzzed against the table. A new email. He read it, and whatever color remained in his face drained out completely. "What is it?" Rebecca asked. He said, "Nothing." I didn't need to see the screen to understand roughly what was happening. "Daniel," I said, "whatever just landed on your phone has nothing to do with why I'm standing here tonight." That single sentence did more to unravel his accusation than anything else could have. If I'd truly come to that party to sabotage him, I wouldn't have needed an email from his own company to do it. Whatever was collapsing around him had been in motion long before I walked through those ballroom doors. I'd simply had the misfortune or the fortune, depending on how you looked at it, of showing up on the exact night it started catching up with him. Daniel finally admitted the company had received another request for documentation more extensive than the last. Rebecca asked directly whether he'd known about these problems before he asked her to connect his company with her firm in the first place. He didn't answer. He looked at the floor, at the ceiling, anywhere but at his wife's face. Rebecca, a lawyer to her core, even in that moment understood exactly what that silence meant. She let go of his arm, and the small physical distance between them said more than any argument could have. My father finally turned to look at me. "Really?" Look the way he hadn't managed all night. "How long have you known about this?" "Long enough to know I wasn't allowed to tell you," I said. "Why didn't you ever tell me what you actually do?" I held his gaze. I tried. The silence between us stretched out heavy and unfamiliar in a room full of music and clinking glasses. "You just never wanted to hear it." A few weeks passed before anyone in the family spoke about that night again with any honesty. I want to be clear about how this actually unfolded, because it wasn't cinematic, and it wasn't instant. Daniel wasn't dragged out in handcuffs. Nothing about that night turned him into a headline. What happened was quieter, and in its own way harder to sit with. The review into Aegis Meridian continued through the proper channels, moving at the deliberate pace those things move at. Daniel was placed on administrative leave, while the company sorted through its own internal accounting of what he had and hadn't disclosed. Rebecca, once she understood the full shape of what her husband might have known formally, recused herself from anything connected to his company, unwilling to let one more piece of her career become collateral damage in his choices. Their marriage didn't survive the aftermath easily. I won't pretend I know every detail of what happened behind their closed doors in the weeks that followed, because that was never mine to know. What I do know is that Rebecca called me one evening, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. "I'm sorry," she said. "For what?" I asked, genuinely unsure which of the many things she might mean. "For thinking your success had to look like mine to count. We didn't fall back into easy sisterhood after one phone call. 8 years of distance doesn't dissolve because someone finally says the right sentence. I didn't forgive her instantly, and I didn't pretend to. But I agreed to meet her for coffee. No audience, no father hovering nearby waiting to referee. It was a small, ordinary thing. 2 sisters sitting across a table, actually asking each other questions instead of assuming answers. It felt like more progress than anything that had happened in that ballroom. My father came to see me not long after. No party this time, no crowd of witnesses to perform for, just a 64-year-old man sitting across from me in my apartment looking older than I remembered. Finally reckoning, with 8 years he couldn't get back. I thought he started choosing his words carefully, that if you didn't choose the path I understood, it meant you were choosing wrong. I didn't rush to make that easier for him. I let him sit in it. You didn't need to understand the army, I said. You just needed to respect me. He nodded slowly, and something in his face looked genuinely worn down, not performing regret, but actually carrying it. Then he repeated the sentence that had lived in me for 8 years, the one I'd never once forgotten, no matter how far I moved or how many ranks I earned. I told you not to come back if you failed. I remember, I said. You didn't fail. I looked at him for a long moment. That was never the problem. He didn't say anything waiting. The problem was, you only thought I deserved to be your daughter if I succeeded the way you wanted me to. He had no answer for that. There wasn't one that would have made it smaller or easier to hear, and to his credit, he didn't try to manufacture one. Snorts, I stood to leave, and just before I reached the door, he asked, quiet and unsure in a way I'd never heard from him before. Do I still have a chance to fix this? You do, I said, but you're starting from zero. Months later, I invited him to an event with my unit. Nothing formal, just a gathering where families were welcome. He asked if he could come, and I said yes. He sat among spouses and parents of the people I served with. And for the first time in his life, he watched the world I'd spent 8 years building instead of hearing about it, secondhand through a phone call he half listened to. Nobody there knew he'd once told me not to come home. Nobody needed to. When I was recognized that evening for something our unit had accomplished, I looked out and saw him standing clapping his face, doing something I hadn't seen it do in a very long time. I didn't feel victorious. I felt something quieter than that, relief mostly. Because the real revenge, if you could even call it that, was never about watching Daniel unravel or making Rebecca question herself or forcing my father to bow his head in some public reckoning. It was simpler than any of that. It was the fact that I had built a life worth being proud of, across 8 years when none of them were paying attention, and I never once needed their permission to do it. 8 years earlier, my father told me not to come back if I failed. I didn't fail. But, more than that, I finally understood I never needed to come back to prove it to him in the first place. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear where it landed. Have you ever had to build a life your family didn't understand quietly without waiting for anyone's approval? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I want to know where you're watching from tonight. We share stories like Teresa's every day. Real conflicts, real families, real reckonings. So if this one stayed with you, subscribe and stay close, because there are so many more good journeys like this one waiting for you. Let's keep walking through these stories.